part 2 of Essential IELTS Grammar. Let's begin.
Let's begin with the active and passive voice. So what is the active voice? Well, in the active voice, the subject is performing an action. For example, the man drives the car. So why is this the active? Because the man is the subject of the sentence and he is driving, which is the verb, the car, which is the object. So then what is the passive voice? Well, in the passive voice, the object becomes the subject. For example, the car is driven by the man. So the car is the subject. Now, why would we have passive and active? Why would we use it and when would we use it? Well, we use the active when the subject is important. And in most cases, we use the active. So then when do we use the passive? Well, the passive is used when we don't know the subject or the subject is not important. It's not something we want to highlight. For example, the car was stolen by the thieves. Why did we make that passive instead of active? Well, we don't know who the thieves are, and the point that we want to highlight in that sentence is that the car was stolen. Another reason people may use the passive voice is to detach from the story. What do I mean by that? Well, if you listen to a news anchor, they often speak in the passive voice because their job is to report on the story and not to be emotionally involved. We also use passive in academic writing because sometimes it can be more formal. In IELTS writing, we want to use passive and active. Now, when it comes to IELTS speaking, it is a little tricky to add the passive voice because it's speaking, and the way we speak is different to the way that we write. And so the passive voice, because we're not mentioning the subject, it can sound a little cold and unnatural and sometimes too informal. However, there are opportunities and there are ways to incorporate the passive voice into your IELTS speaking test. Why have I mentioned the active and passive voice? Well, changing the passive to the active or the active to the passive is one way you can paraphrase. Now, paraphrasing is a really important part of the IELTS exam because you need to paraphrase the question in your answer, and sometimes you need to paraphrase your own words to avoid repetition. So never repeat the question and try and avoid repeating yourself, even your own words. There are a few other ways to paraphrase, and I will create a video on how to paraphrase because once you learn this, it becomes really easy and simple and, like I say, a vital part of the IELTS exam. In the IELTS band descriptors, repetition is mentioned. So we need to avoid repetition, and we do that by paraphrasing. Let's move on to tenses. Now, it's important to use a variety of tenses in your IELTS writing and speaking exam. It's also important to know how to answer a question. So, what tense should you respond in? What tense is the question in, and how can you respond? Some IELTS teachers even recommend the PPF method for your Part 2 speaking exam. Now, what is a PPF? It stands for past, present, and future. So what this method says is you use all three tenses for one subject. For example, let's say you get a cue card that says describe your favorite book, or rather describe a book you've recently read. So you would take that topic of reading, the subject of reading, and you would use PPF, meaning you would think about a book you've read in the past, a book you're currently reading, and a book you would like to read. So this method is a way for students to use all three tenses. Do I recommend this method? If you are able to use this strategy correctly without getting confused or feeling overwhelmed, then great, use it. It is a way to incorporate a variety of tenses in your answer. I find that this method works brilliantly for some students, but not so brilliantly for others, because it can be a little bit tricky if you don't practice or if the strategy confuses you. So you have to find a strategy that works for you. But the reason I'm even mentioning this strategy is because I want to highlight the importance of using a variety of tenses. It's so important that students and teachers will teach a method like the PPF method. So let's do a quick review of tenses since they are so important. So past simple. I studied English yesterday. Past continuous. I was studying English. Past perfect. I had studied English. Past perfect continuous. I had been studying English. So present simple. I studied English. Present continuous. I am studying English. Present perfect. I have studied English. Present perfect continuous. I have been studying English. That means you're still doing it. Future simple. I will study English. Future continuous. I will be studying English. Future perfect. I will have studied English. Future perfect continuous. I will have been studying English. So my suggestion when it comes to learning tenses is to practice exercises over and over and over again until it clicks. Because you can listen to a grammar rule, but if it doesn't click, what do I mean by click? I mean, if you don't fully understand it or you don't know how to use it, then it doesn't matter if you can say the grammar rule. We can all explain grammar rules, but when we have to use that grammar rule, that's when it becomes tricky. So my advice is to practice tenses as much as you can, and remember to look at the question. What tense is the question in? For example, when you get your task card for IELTS Speaking Part 2, look at the topic question and understand the tense that topic question is in. And then look at the bullet points and look for opportunities to use a variety of sentences. So when you see the question when did you do something? Decide, okay, what tense can I use here? So when you're planning your talk, think about the tenses that you will use. Okay, so now let's move on to conditionals. Why are conditionals important? Because they are complex sentences, and there are opportunities in your IELTS speaking test and even your IELTS writing test where you can use conditionals, and you should. So let's do a brief overview of conditionals. So what is the zero conditional? Well, zero conditionals are used to talk about general truths and laws of nature. We use zero conditionals to talk about things that always happen under certain conditions. For example, if it rains, we get wet. If the water boils, it is not cold, right? So these are general truths and scientific facts. What is the grammatical structure for zero conditionals? Well, it's present tense and present tense. So both parts of the sentence are in the present tense. So let's look at that example again. If it rains, comma, we get wet. So both parts of that sentence are in the present. Now we can also switch the sentence around and remove the comma. For example, we get wet if it rains. Now in that sentence, we do not need the comma. We only need to use the comma if the conditional comes first. So when we use if in the beginning of the sentence, then we need to use a comma. You don't need a comma if the conditional doesn't come first. Okay, so what is the first conditional? Well, we use the first conditional to talk about real possibilities or real conditionals. In other words, the first conditional is used with events that will likely happen in the future. So what is the grammatical structure for the first conditional? Well, here is an example sentence. If it rains, comma, I will get wet. So as you can see, it's present tense and future tense. So one part of the sentence is present, the second part is future. Now, can we also switch the sentence around? Yes, we can. We can put the conditional at the end of the sentence. So we can say, we will go to the park if it is sunny. Now, once again, there is no comma. We do not have a comma if the conditional is at the end of the sentence. It's the second part of the sentence. But if the conditional is first, how do we know if the conditional is first? Well, we have if something happens. If the conditional is first, then we need the comma. So if it is sunny, comma, we will go to the park. Now, as you can see, the first conditional is based on probability. It will probably happen. Zero conditional is based on a general truth, meaning it's 100%. There is no doubt that it will happen. Okay, so what are second conditionals? Well, we use second conditionals to talk about hypothetical, unreal situations or dreams. It is not true, so the results aren't true either. It's to talk about impossible present situations. What is the grammatical structure for this? Well, we use if plus the past simple and then would plus the infinitive. For example, if he had money, comma, he would buy a big house. And we can swap that around and we can say he would buy a big house if he had money. Again, when the conditional is at the end of the sentence and we don't begin the sentence with the conditional, then we can remove the comma. But if we start off the sentence with if, then we need the comma. A great place to use the second conditional is in part 3 of the IELTS speaking test, because one of the common question types is hypothetical questions. And so if you get asked a hypothetical question, you can answer with a hypothetical answer. You can answer using the second conditional because that's what we use to talk about hypothetical situations. And that's what I mean by looking for opportunities to use certain grammatical structures. And lastly, let's talk about third conditionals. So we use the third conditional to talk about hypothetical, unreal situations or unfulfilled dreams in the past which didn't come true. So that's the difference between second and third conditional, is that in the third conditional, it didn't come true. So it's almost like a regret. You looking back and you are regretting a certain situation. It's impossible to change that situation. So we use had plus the past participle and then have and the past participle. For example, if I had gone to school, comma, I could have been a pilot. So as you can see, there's a sense of regret in that sentence. The person saying this cannot change the situation. They can't go back to school. They can't be a pilot. They feel like it's too late. And that is the difference between second and third conditional. Another example is, if I had studied, I would have passed. Let's use that example sentence to talk about all the conditionals. So starting with zero conditional. If I study, comma, I pass. First conditional. If I study, comma, I will pass. Second conditional. If I studied, comma, I would pass. Third conditional. If I had studied, comma, I would have passed. And for the third conditional, we can also say, I would have passed if I had studied. Now remember, as I've said in this video a few times now, if we don't start the sentence with the conditional, then we don't need the comma. But if we start the sentence with the conditional, with the if, then we need the comma. So how do you get good at conditionals? You practice, and you apply it to your everyday life. Now, when I say everyday life, I mean apply it to a real life situation. If the third conditional talks about regret, then think about something that you regret. And that's how you apply this grammar to a real life situation. And if you can do that, then you will remember the grammar rule and you will know how to apply it in context because you're connecting your experience to this grammar rule. So in this video, we did quite a bit. We did the passive and the active voice. We did a brief overview of tenses and we discussed conditionals. If you have any questions, then please ask me in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, then please like, share, and subscribe for more.